The metallic taste of blood clung to his tongue, and the silence of the house screamed louder than any siren. Michael Peterson stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, the dim chandelier casting fractured shadows across the polished oak floors. His palms were sticky, slick with a mix of sweat and something darker, he couldn't tell which. The faint scent of alcohol lingered in the air, mingling with the faint, unplaceable aroma of misfortune. The body lay sprawled across the bottom steps, a grotesque mimicry of motionless grace. Catherine's hair fanned out like dark water, her eyes half closed, lips parted as if to whisper one last secret. One slipper had flown to the side, the other clung stubbornly to her foot, like a witness refusing to leave. A bead of sweat slid down Michael's temple, sticky and cold. He could hear the faint drip of water from somewhere in the hall, a rhythm that mocked him. Each drip was a tick, each tick a reminder. This moment, this house, this night, would never be forgotten. The phone rang in the living room, a shrill, accusing ring that shattered the quiet. He didn't move. He couldn't. When the second ring came, he snatched it up with trembling fingers. "Hello." His voice was hoarse, uneven, foreign to his own ears. "Mr. Peterson, it's the police. We've received a call about an incident at your residence." He blinked. Blinked again. He should have said something. Anything. But the words lodged in his throat, heavy and ironic. The irony of it all pressed down on him like the oak staircase itself. A life spent crafting mysteries, now trapped in one. Outside, a siren howled through the night, cutting across the humid air. Michael stared at the body, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios, each more absurd than the last. Did she fall? Did he push her? Was it even possible to tell any more? In this house, in this life, truth had become slippery. He knelt beside her, touching the hem of her blouse, feeling the dampness, the chill. And in that instant, the absurdity of it all struck him, a novelist, a storyteller, now at the mercy of a story he did not write. The scene was perfect. The tragedy, the horror, the dark humor of fate itself. He could almost hear a narrator's voice, dripping with sarcasm. Here lies the man who wrote thrillers but never imagined living one. A distant knock at the front door. He froze. Someone new. Or maybe it was just the universe, observing, amused, ready to record every misstep. The first chapter of his nightmare had begun, and Michael Peterson had no idea that the night was far from over. Do you think the truth always sides with the victim? Think again. Michael Peterson stared at the staircase, now a silent witness to the chaos. Every polished step, every shadowed corner, seemed to mock him. The blood that had been Catherine's was now a stain on his life, an indelible mark on the story he never wanted to star in. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, the bitter smoke curling in the cold air. Life, it seems, has a dark sense of humor, he thought. One moment, he was a celebrated novelist, a family man admired in the small circles of North Carolina. The next, he was the central figure in a nightmare broadcast to the world. The irony was pungent, almost comedic, if not for the horror of it all. Outside, the police lights flashed, casting red and blue patterns across the manicured lawn. Michael knew the world was watching, every whisper, every rumor, every headline already written in advance. They would see him, see the husband, see the suspect. But would they see the man? Or just the story? And then the question gnawed at him. Did anyone really know the truth? In this life, truth was a slippery shadow, a shapeshifter. A fall down a staircase could be an accident, a confession, or a carefully plotted murder. The world would decide, not him. And sometimes, the verdict came long before the evidence. Michael remembered the night vividly, each detail twisting in his mind like a story he couldn't control. The argument over nothing, the laughter that felt forced, the half-empty glass of wine that had cooled too quickly. Could a life be reduced to a single moment? And so the story began, not with the fall, not with the body, but with the questions that had no easy answers. Michael Peterson was a man of contradictions. A celebrated novelist, he had spent decades spinning tales of mystery and murder, but his own life teetered on the edge of the stories he wrote. On the surface, he was polished, charming, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years standing before classrooms, lecterns, and dinner parties. His wardrobe reflected a taste for understated elegance, crisp shirts, tailored blazers, the occasional navy sweater that gave him the look of a man who could belong anywhere. Yet the details betrayed the complexity beneath. The faint scent of cigarette smoke clung to his coat, a reminder of nights spent alone, the quiet ritual of contemplation before sleep. His hands, though capable of typing pages of intricate prose, trembled slightly when faced with the unexpected. Even his walk held a tension, a measured step that hinted at someone used to navigating both literal and figurative staircases. He was a father, a husband, a veteran of the United States Navy. He had seen war, had faced the tangible chaos of battle, yet nothing had prepared him for the battlefield within his own home. He adored his children, or at least, the image of him that he carefully curated. Dinner conversations were warm, jokes were shared, but beneath the surface lay subtle fractures. Arguments disguised as humor, glances heavy with unspoken frustration, and the occasional shadow of dread in Catherine's eyes. Catherine, for her part, had been a complex partner, beautiful, intelligent, fiercely independent. She held her family together with grace, but her private frustrations sometimes manifested in sharp words, subtle digs that left Michael wondering if the life he'd built was real or merely theatrical. Theirs was a marriage that could have been lifted from the pages of one of his own novels, full of hidden tensions, irony, and a sense that destiny had a perverse sense of timing. Michael's friends often joked that he was the kind of man who could write a death scene so convincingly that the reader would feel it in their bones, but he could never write his own way out of a crisis. He lives life like a thriller, they said, laughing. Except the plot twists don't make sense until after the fact. And yet, despite the darkness, there was charm. A warmth that drew people in. A glimmer of wit in the shadow of tragedy. The kind of man who could narrate a story with biting sarcasm, make a room laugh, and then leave it unsettled with the sudden twist of a word or glance. He was complex, like the staircases he would later become infamous for, a structure that could support or betray, depending on the angle of the light. It was in these contradictions that Michael Peterson lived, and it was these contradictions that would define the night of Catherine's fall. The public would see him an accused, a suspect, a headline. But the truth? The truth hid in the spaces between words, the moments unobserved, the pauses in laughter. The house smelled of wine and rain. The night had fallen heavy, pressing against the windows with a weight that made the air inside feel thick, almost viscous. Michael Peterson sat at the dining table, glass in hand, staring at the half-empty bottle of red. He could hear Catherine moving upstairs, the faint sound of footsteps on carpet, the occasional creak of wood, ordinary noises, yet in the dark, they became a chorus of suspicion. They had argued earlier that evening, though it wasn't an argument that could be pinned down. Words were exchanged, laughter forced, apologies whispered like fragile paper boats drifting on a stormy sea. Michael tried to recall the exact moment when tension morphed into something irretrievable. It eluded him. Then came the fall. A sharp, hollow sound echoed through the house, like a branch breaking in a distant forest. Michael's heart skipped, his hands trembling as he ran to the staircase. The scene was grotesquely familiar. Catherine sprawled across the bottom steps, her body angled in a way that made him question everything he thought he knew about gravity, fate, and consequence. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking, trying to check for signs of life. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, a bitter perfume of inevitability. He wanted to call someone, but his voice stuck in his throat, strangled by disbelief and fear. And then the absurdity of it hit him, the irony of a life spent constructing suspense and mystery, now trapped in one. He could almost hear the narrator's voice, dripping with sarcasm. Here lies the husband who loved a story more than he ever loved clarity. He noticed small details that would later become obsession. The way her hair had fanned across the carpet, the precise angle of the fall, the slipper that refused to come off. Each detail was a potential clue, a potential accusation. And somewhere, in the corner of his mind, he wondered if it mattered. Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping the windows in irregular rhythms. A siren wailed in the distance. Michael could feel the world closing in, the night stretching forward into an endless series of questions he couldn't answer. He realized, with a bitter twist of humor, that life had handed him a narrative far darker than any he could write. This was the night everything changed. The fall wasn't just a physical event, it was a fracture. A crack that split his life into before and after. The investigation, the media, the courtrooms, the whispers of suspicion, they all began here, in this house, on this staircase, in the cold and wet shadows of a night that refused to let go. And somewhere, in the silence between raindrops, the question lingered. Did he fail her? Or had fate simply decided to write the cruelest plot twist of all? The morning brought flashing lights and unfamiliar voices. Police cars lined the driveway like silent judges, their sirens muted by distance but felt in every fiber of the house. Michael Peterson opened the door to officers he barely knew, their badges glinting in the weak dawn light. They stepped inside, their shoes leaving dark prints on the polished floors, moving like predators disguised as protectors. Questions came fast, blunt, relentless. Where were you when it happened? Did you hear a sound? How long had she been like this? Every query landed like a hammer strike, each one exposing the frail veneer of composure Michael had so carefully constructed. Forensics arrived next. White gloves, black markers, and an arsenal of equipment that transformed the familiar house into a crime scene. Photographs, measurements, careful dusting for fingerprints, rituals that turned life into a spectacle. The staircase, once a simple architectural detail, became a monument to tragedy. Every scratch, every splinter was analyzed as if the house itself could testify. And then came the media. Reporters swarmed like birds sensing blood, pens scratching, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. Headlines formed before facts could settle. Novelist's wife found dead in suspicious fall, Michael Peterson. Husband or killer, murder mystery at home. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had built careers on suspense now starred in the most public thriller of all, without a single line of his own choosing. His friends and neighbors whispered, and sometimes they didn't whisper at all. I always wondered if he was capable, one neighbor said, eyes wide with speculative glee. Another remarked, he always had a dramatic streak, guess it finally went too far. Michael wanted to laugh, but it came out as a dry, humorless cough. Life had delivered sarcasm sharper than any pen he had ever held. Experts debated, theorized, and contradicted one another. One claimed it was an accident, another implied foul play. Alcohol, height of the fall, possible prior injuries, all dissected and displayed like trophies. Michael watched, amused and horrified, as the world turned his life into a case study in irony. And all the while, the staircase waited. Silent. Indifferent. Every polished step a reminder of how quickly ordinary life could fracture into chaos. Through it all, Michael Peterson remained a paradox. Calm enough to answer questions, sarcastic enough to survive media scrutiny, but haunted by the knowledge that perception had already condemned him in the court of public opinion. He had survived wars. He had taught literature. He had written endings no one else could imagine. Yet here, in his own home, reality had rewritten him entirely. Every knock on the door, every flash of a camera, every scribbled note in a reporter's pad reminded him. The investigation had only just begun. The world was watching, and somewhere, in the tension between truth and assumption, the first seeds of doubt and fear were planted. And Michael knew it. He just didn't know how deep they would grow. The house, once familiar, now seemed like a labyrinth. Every room held a memory, every shadow a secret. Michael wandered through it like a ghost, half expecting whispers from walls, half expecting Catherine to appear with that sharp glance that always cut through pretense. His children were subdued, their laughter stripped of ease. They answered questions politely, eyes darting toward him, then away, silent accusations hidden in innocent gestures. Their statements, carefully collected by investigators, were as contradictory as they were revealing. She stumbled, one said. He wasn't there, said another. Michael could see the trap forming. Truth twisted into multiple shapes, each version a weapon or a shield depending on who wielded it. The investigators found fragments, small, almost absurd details that took on monumental importance. A half-empty wine bottle in the kitchen. A bruise on Catherine's arm, old enough to provoke speculation. A missing cell phone charger. Each clue was a splinter pointing somewhere, yet nowhere at all. Michael felt the suffocating irony. He, a master of constructing narrative threads, was now at the mercy of threads spun by others, threads that led to doubt, suspicion, and public condemnation. Even the neighbors, with their sharp tongues and prying eyes, became unreliable narrators. Gossip became evidence, speculation masqueraded as fact. He read an article claiming, with certainty, that he had been violent in the past, though the story had no foundation. Another implied that Catherine's fall had been intentional, though no one knew how or why. Michael almost laughed at the absurdity. The universe had turned his life into a grotesque parody of his own novels. And yet, amid the chaos, there were real secrets. Catherine's personal struggles, hidden anxieties, late-night phone calls to friends, fragments of a life no one outside the family truly understood. Michael had loved her, yes, but had he really known her? Or had he, like so many others, projected stories onto her, fitting her life into the neat narratives he could comprehend? The courtroom drama hadn't yet begun, but the play was already staged. Every lie, half-truth, and misinterpreted gesture became ammunition for a story larger than life. Michael felt the weight of it pressing down, a philosophical realization creeping in. Truth is rarely singular, rarely simple. It is a prism, refracting in different directions, each angle producing a version that feels just as real as the next. The night of the fall had cracked more than bones, it had cracked reality itself. And in those cracks, secrets crawled, waiting to be uncovered, or misinterpreted entirely. As Michael stared at the staircase once more, he wondered which version of the truth would survive. The accident, the violence, the irony of fate itself, all possibilities loomed like dark clouds. And someone, somewhere, was already waiting for him to make a mistake. Because in this house, in this life, lies were easier to find than clarity. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension. Michael Peterson entered, the soles of his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that seemed to mark the seconds of his life slipping away. Cameras flashed outside, reporters scribbled notes, and every eye in the room seemed to weigh him before a word was spoken. He sat, straight-backed, hands folded. His lawyer whispered last-minute reminders, but the words felt hollow. He could see the judge's eyes, sharp and calculating, measuring the men before her. The jury watched silently, some sympathetic, others skeptical, all curious. And somewhere, Catherine's absence hung like a shadow over every bench, every desk, every whispered conversation. The prosecution began with force. Evidence was presented with meticulous precision. Blood spatter patterns, alleged inconsistencies in Michael's statements, testimonies from family and friends. Each point was a strike against him, a nail in a narrative crafted not by him, but by others. Michael listened, detached at first, then with a growing sense of dread. Every word, every slide, every chart seemed to mock the life he had known. Then the defense rose. Michael watched them try to reconstruct a world he knew intimately, yet now seemed alien. Arguments of accident, misunderstandings, and lack of concrete proof were laid out carefully. Yet the courtroom had a rhythm of its own, a rhythm that didn't always reward truth. Sometimes, it rewarded spectacle. Witnesses were called. Children testified with halting voices, their words both protective and accusatory. Friends and neighbors painted contradictory pictures, as if reality were a kaleidoscope, and each turn revealed a different image. Experts disagreed publicly, their voices rising and clashing, leaving the audience to navigate a storm of confusion. Michael caught himself imagining the irony. Here he was, a man who had spent his life creating suspense, now living a suspense more brutal than any he had written. Dark humor surfaced unbidden. At least the critics can't give me a bad review. Days passed in this strange rhythm, punctuated by revelations, contradictions, and public commentary. The media covered every detail, sometimes ignoring nuance in favor of sensationalism. He was portrayed as villain, victim, and enigma, all at once. Michael realized that in the court of public opinion, nuance was the enemy, and clarity a rare commodity. And then came the turning points, moments when the trial tilted. New evidence, conflicting reports, forensic debates that questioned assumptions. Each shift in perspective was like a gust of wind on a cliff edge, threatening to throw him into irrelevance or guilt. Michael's mind raced. Could anyone ever truly know the truth? Could justice exist in a world where perception often outweighed reality? The moral weight pressed down on him. He knew that even if he walked free, the shadow of doubt would linger, invisible yet palpable, shaping every glance, every word, every future step. In that room, the boundaries between justice and narrative blurred, leaving him to wonder. What was guilt? What was innocence? And what, if anything, could save him from the story that had already been written without his consent? The staircase was no longer just a staircase. It was a monument to human ambiguity, to the fragile, slippery nature of truth. As the gavel prepared to fall, Michael Peterson understood the cruel lesson. In life, as in fiction, the ending is rarely neat, and the consequences often linger long after the final word is spoken. The courtroom was silent except for the gavel's echo, sharp and final. Michael Peterson stood as the judge read the sentence, each word a nail sealing the chapter of his life he had once believed untouchable. Years of uncertainty, scrutiny, and public fascination condensed into a single moment. The verdict was more than law, it was the world's judgment, layered with irony and consequence. He listened, aware that the words were both relief and condemnation. The media outside erupted, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Guilty, some headlines screamed. Accident. Others whispered. The truth, as always, remained somewhere between what was said, what was seen, and what was assumed. Michael walked out of the courthouse into the harsh sunlight, feeling the weight of every eye on him. The street smelled of exhaust and damp asphalt, ordinary life continuing around him as if nothing had happened. Neighbors whispered, some with sympathy, others with judgment, but none truly understanding the gravity of a man's inner world unraveling. He returned home to a house forever changed. The staircase, once simply part of domestic architecture, now loomed as a monument to a night that had reshaped everything. It had claimed more than one life, it had claimed certainty, peace, and innocence. Friends and family reacted in ways he could scarcely anticipate. Some were supportive, some estranged, others wary of the shadow that had grown over the family name. The irony of it all was bitter. He had survived wars, taught literature, authored novels that dissected human folly, yet a single night at home had toppled everything. The public, ever hungry for spectacle, moved on quickly. New scandals, new tragedies, new headlines replaced his story, but Michael's life remained tethered to the staircase. Each memory, each moment replayed with merciless clarity. Even humor seemed tainted by gravity. The dark comedy of his situation was undeniable, but laughter felt hollow. He reflected on the philosophical weight of it all. Justice had been served, or at least, a version of it. Yet he understood, with a painful clarity, that life rarely offers closure. Truth was mutable, and perception often overpowered fact. Every choice, every misstep, every unseen glance could shift the narrative in ways one could neither predict nor control. And so, Michael Peterson learned the cost of human frailty, the weight of consequence, and the irony of fate. He had been a storyteller, yes, but the ultimate story, one written by accident, suspicion, and the indifference of the universe, had been lived, not imagined. He had survived the judgment of the law, but he could never survive the judgment of chance, of circumstance, of the endless speculation that clung to his name like a shadow. And somewhere, in the quiet of the house, the staircase remained. Silent. Indifferent. Waiting for the next story, the next fall, the next moment when life would remind him that some truths never truly belonged to anyone. The staircase stood quietly, an unchanging witness to lives upended, truths obscured, and questions that could never be fully answered. Each polished step reflected a fragment of the past. The laughter that had once echoed through the halls, the whispered arguments, the silences heavier than any shout. Michael Peterson often found himself staring at it, tracing the contours with his eyes, as if the wood itself could reveal secrets withheld from human memory. He realized then that the staircase was more than architecture, it was a metaphor, a monument to human uncertainty. Life, like those steps, demanded balance. One misstep, one moment of distraction, and everything could collapse. The irony was bitter. He had spent decades orchestrating suspense, designing endings, manipulating perceptions. And yet, here he was, living a story beyond his control, dictated by chance, fear, and the judgment of others. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor far darker than any pen could capture. He reflected on truth, the fragile, elusive creature that everyone claimed to pursue. In court, in media, in whispered conversations among friends and neighbors, truth was bent, refracted, and reshaped. Every perspective created a different version of reality, each equally convincing. In the end, he understood. Perhaps truth had never been the point. Perhaps it was the consequence, the reflection, the cost of perception that defined life. Michael's thoughts wandered to Catherine. Not to blame, not to mourn, but to question. Had her fall been accident or design, a cruel twist or the inevitable outcome of unseen fractures? He would never know. And perhaps, in the grand design, the universe intended that he should not. The story required ambiguity, just as life did. The children moved on, the media moved on, society moved on. And yet he remained, tethered to memory, to consequence, to a home forever altered by a single night. The staircase, indifferent and patient, awaited no applause, no understanding, no redemption. Dark humor surfaced once more, a small, bitter smile. A man who could kill with words now struggled to survive a narrative written by reality itself. Sometimes, Michael thought, the cruelest lesson is that there is no perfect ending. There are only steps, each one a choice, a fall, a reflection of the human condition. Some steps lead upward, some lead downward, and most are impossible to read until it's too late. And sometimes, the truth vanishes with those who knew it. He turned away from the staircase, knowing he would return. Not to rewrite, not to understand, but to remember. To live with the consequence of a life where the boundary between fate and free will was blurred, where justice and irony danced together on polished wood, and where the price of human error was measured not in years or dollars, but in moments of unbearable clarity. The house remained silent, the staircase unyielding, the night eternal. And in that silence, Michael Peterson understood the ultimate story. Life is a staircase, and every fall, intentional or accidental, is a story that belongs to no one but the universe.